My name is Jade Morgan. I am 29 years old. 20 minutes before my wedding reception began, I found my parents' place cards sitting on a plastic folding table next to a trash can. Table 18, the last table in the room. Meanwhile, 9 people from my husband's family, along with 3 private equity investors, occupied the main table, the table where my father, a county mechanic, and my mother, a middle school bus driver, were supposed to sit. When I confronted my fiancé about it, his response forced me to realize I was not marrying a partner. I was marrying a fraud. I stood in the hallway of the Oakwood Country Club in my wedding dress and realized I held the power to end his entire family's reputation, and I used it. What I did, the secret I exposed to 300 elite guests, and the financial ruin that followed is the story I am about to tell you. Before I do, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the afternoon the illusion shattered. I am a 911 dispatcher in Raleigh, North Carolina. I manage chaos for a living. For 7 years. My career has been defined by the ability to isolate a crisis through the static of a headset. You learn to read the signs before the sirens even start. You hear a sharp breath, a specific hesitation in a caller's voice, and you know exactly what kind of disaster is unfolding. But standing in the foyer of that country club on a humid Saturday afternoon, the disaster did not announce itself with a frantic phone call. It arrived on a sheet of heavy cream paper printed in gold cursive, the master seating chart. The reception was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Through the mahogany doors, the venue was a study in curated wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over 30 round tables. A string quartet tuned their cellos near the terrace. Waiters in pressed black vests moved fluidly, setting down chilled champagne flutes. I bypassed the floral archway and looked for my parents' names on the VIP table layout. Beatrice Caldwell, Richard Caldwell, my fiancé Preston's parents. Following their names were the placeholders for the Harrison Group, 3 men who controlled the largest investment portfolios inside the Beltline, 9 seats taken by old money and active capital. I looked for Tom and Sarah Morgan. My father spent 30 years rebuilding diesel engines for the county maintenance yard. He has grease permanently settled into his calluses. He worked double shifts to pay off our mortgage. My mother drives a middle school bus route and knows exactly which kids come to school hungry. They are the kind of people who leave the porch light on and keep their front door unlocked. They are the foundation of my life. Their names were missing from the front of the room. A cold, clinical focus settled over me, the exact sensation that takes over when a routine call upgrades to a code red. I left the bridal suite attendant behind and walked into the empty ballroom. I passed the tables nearest the dance floor, populated by Caldwell Investment Associates. I passed the middle tier filled with Preston's fraternity brothers and country club members. I kept walking. The air grew warmer. The scent of gardenias gave way to the sharp industrial smell of dish soap and roasted meat. Table 18. It was tucked against the far back wall. The overhead lighting here was dim, cast in the shadow of an exit sign. But it was not just the location that made my stomach drop. Table 18 was a plastic folding table covered by a thin linen cloth that did not quite reach the floor. The chairs lacked the velvet cushions provided to the rest of the room. 2 feet to the left hung a pair of scuffed aluminum doors with small reinforced windows, the swinging entrance to the main kitchen. Every time a waiter came through, those doors would hit the back of the nearest chair. Right next to that chair sat a gray rubber busboy station complete with a foot pedal trash bin meant for scraping plates. I looked at the 2 place cards resting on the uneven table surface. Tom Morgan. Sarah Morgan. The paper was not gold embossed like the front tables. It was standard printer stock. I stood there in my wedding dress listening to the clatter of industrial sinks on the other side of the wall. Preston had not just moved my parents to the back of the room. He and his mother expected a mechanic and a bus driver to sit next to the garbage, keep their mouths shut, and be grateful for the invitation to their own daughter's wedding. As I stared at those cheap folding chairs, the last year of my life played back in my head. The subtle red flags I had ignored. Preston introducing my dad to banking clients at dinner parties as a fleet management executive rather than a diesel mechanic. The way his mother, Beatrice, always managed to schedule dress fittings and cake tastings during my mother's bus route hours so she could not attend. They were slowly erasing my blue-collar roots to fit their pristine, high society aesthetic. Moving my parents to the trash was not a sudden decision. It was the final stage of a calculated campaign to scrub my family from their brand. And standing next to that foot pedal trash can, I realized the man I loved had been holding the eraser the entire time. I traced the printed letters of my father's name on the cheap cardstock. The industrial refrigerator on the other side of the kitchen wall kicked into high gear. The floorboards vibrated under my satin heels. A thin draft of warm air smelling of bleach and cooked onions seeped through the crack in the aluminum swinging doors. This was not a seating error. This was a quarantine. The Caldwell family was ensuring that their wealthy investors would not catch the scent of the working class. As I stared at the uneven legs of the folding table, the facade I had been living in for 2 years began to dissolve. You can only ignore the signs for so long before your own intuition forces you to look at the evidence. In my line of work, when a caller gives you an address that does not match the GPS coordinates on your screen, you do not trust the caller. You trust the grid. For 2 years, Preston had been giving me the wrong coordinates. Preston was a junior vice president at his family's boutique investment firm. He represented old Raleigh money, the kind of wealth that does not need to show off because it owns the buildings everyone else shows off in. When we first met, he felt like a grounded escape from the relentless 12-hour night shifts at the dispatch center. He wore custom-tailored suits, but he would bring me black coffee at 3:00 in the morning and sit in his luxury sedan while I decompressed from listening to domestic disputes and highway collisions. I thought we were a perfect balance. I thought he respected my world. I was wrong. He did not respect my world. He saw it as a public relations asset. Having a frontline first responder on his arm played beautifully at charity galas. It made him look grounded. It made him look charitable. But the illusion required a very strict narrative, and my parents did not fit the script. The first real crack in the foundation happened 7 months ago. It was a winter fundraising banquet at the State Art Museum. My father had rented a tuxedo for the occasion. He is a broad-shouldered man built by decades of manual labor, and he looked uncomfortable in the stiff, rented collar. He spent the first hour standing near the edge of the room, holding a glass of club soda, trying not to take up too much space. Preston walked over to us with a senior partner from a major private equity group. I smiled, preparing to introduce my dad, but Preston stepped in front of me. He shook the partner's hand and gestured to my father. He did not say, "This is Tom. He rebuilds diesel engines for the county." Instead, Preston smiled his practiced corporate smile and said, "This is Jade's father, Tom. He is a fleet management executive for the Municipal Transit Authority." I watched my dad freeze. His calloused thumb stopped tapping the edge of his glass. I saw the immediate confusion register in his eyes, followed a split second later by the quiet, heavy realization of what was happening. He was being rebranded. My father swallowed his pride, offered a polite nod, and shook the investor's hand so he would not embarrass his future son-in-law. When we got in the car that night, I asked Preston why he lied. He did not apologize. He laughed it off. He told me he was just translating my dad's job into language those finance guys understand. He said it was networking. I let it go. I told myself he was just trying to help my dad fit in, but standing here now next to a foot pedal trash can, the truth was glaringly obvious. Preston was not translating. He was erasing. He was coaching my family to lie about their own existence, so his colleagues would not realize he was marrying into the working class. That single introduction was the opening move. From there, his mother Beatrice took over the campaign. Beatrice Caldwell operates with the kind of ruthless, polite aggression that only wealthy Southern women can truly master. She never raised her voice. She never insulted my parents directly. Instead, she managed them like a public relations crisis. She treated my mother not as the mother of the bride, but as an incompetent vendor who kept ruining the aesthetic. When my mother offered to hand-stitch the cloth napkins for the reception, Beatrice smiled her ceramic smile. She gently patted my mother's hand and said they had already contracted a bespoke linen service from Charleston because the venue required a certain caliber of presentation. When my mother asked if she could bake her signature pecan cookies for the hotel welcome bags, Beatrice sighed softly. She said sugar and flour were just a bit too rustic for the demographic they were hosting. Rustic. That was the word she used. It was a polite, sanitized substitute for poor. Every attempt my parents made to contribute was intercepted and neutralized. Beatrice scheduled dress fittings on weekday mornings, knowing perfectly well my mother was driving her bus route and could not afford to take unpaid time off. She arranged floral consultations at private country clubs where my parents would feel entirely out of place. She built an invisible velvet rope around the entire wedding process, ensuring my family stayed on the outside looking in, and Preston let her do it. Whenever I tried to draw a boundary, he would employ the exact same tactic. He would rub my shoulders, tell me I was stressed from my dispatch shifts, and urge me to just let his mother handle the details. He framed it as a favor. He told me she was taking the burden off our shoulders. I touched the thin linen tablecloth on table 18. It was not a favor. It was an eviction. I looked back towards the front of the empty ballroom. The crystal glassware at table 1 caught the afternoon light throwing prisms across the polished dance floor. The Caldwell family crest was subtly embossed on their menu cards. They had curated a flawless high society performance. They wanted the heroic blue-collar bride to make Preston look like a man of the people, but they wanted to bulldoze the neighborhood she came from. They wanted my dad hidden behind the kitchen doors where his rough hands would not ruin their photos. They wanted my mom sitting next to a busboy station so her department store dress would not clash with the silk gowns of the private equity wives. The clinical detachment in my mind sharpened into something harder. In the dispatch center, when you realize a situation has turned hostile, you do not panic. You secure the line. You gather the intel. You prepare to deploy the correct response. I was not going to let my parents walk into this room and take their seats at this folding table. I was not going to watch my father pull out a chair next to a garbage bin and smile through the humiliation just to give me a perfect day. I turned away from table 18, my mind racing through the timeline of the afternoon. I needed to find Preston. I needed to look him in the eye and give him one final chance to explain himself. I needed to see if the man I agreed to marry had any spine at all, or if he was just an extension of his mother's ego. I took a step toward the center aisle. Before my heel could hit the floor, the aluminum doors behind me swung open with a sharp squeak of ungreased hinges. I stepped back into the shadows of the exit sign. A waiter rushed out carrying a stack of empty silver serving trays. But he was not alone. Right behind him, holding a heavy clipboard and looking paler than the ivory tablecloths, was the venue manager. He stopped right outside the kitchen doors, blocking the path of the wedding coordinator. I froze, holding my breath. The venue manager kept his voice low, but the acoustics of the empty ballroom carried every frantic syllable directly to where I stood. He tapped his pen aggressively against his clipboard. He told the coordinator they had a catastrophic problem. He said he had just received a call from their corporate accounting office. The Caldwell's final payment had not cleared. The words hung in the warm air between the kitchen doors and the edge of table 18. The final payment had not cleared. I stood frozen in the shadow of the exit sign. In my line of work, you learn to identify the exact moment a situation upgrades from a nuisance to a verified emergency. It is never a loud noise. It is usually a sudden shift in tone. The venue manager's voice possessed that specific tight frequency. He was not complaining about a late floral delivery. He was staring down a financial disaster. I watched him through the narrow gap between the decorative pillars. He was tapping his pen against his leather clipboard, his face flushed red. The wedding coordinator stood opposite him, shaking her head. She whispered that the catering staff was currently plating 300 salads. The filet mignon was already resting. The champagne was uncorked. They were 20 minutes away from serving a 5-course meal to the wealthiest people in the county, and the check had bounced. I pressed my back against the wall. The pieces of the last 24 hours began to collide in my mind, reassembling themselves into a much darker picture. The Caldwell family had hijacked the wedding budget 8 months ago. Preston and I originally planned a simple evening at a downtown loft space, but Beatrice intervened. She insisted on a specific aesthetic. She claimed her family needed a venue suitable for hosting their primary investors. She booked the Oakwood Country Club. She ordered hand-blown glass centerpieces, imported orchids, and custom velvet chair covers. The total cost of the reception ballooned to $150,000. When I voiced my discomfort with the price tag, Beatrice smiled her polished smile and told me not to worry about the math. She said Caldwell Investments would sponsor the evening as a corporate hosting expense. She called it an investment in their brand. I assumed she was just showing off her wealth. Now, staring at my parents' cheap place cards, I realized she was not showing off. She was putting on a survival performance. My mind rewound to the rehearsal dinner the night before. We were on the stone terrace of a high-end steakhouse. Beatrice was wearing a tailored silk suit, holding a martini glass drifting between tables of private equity partners. But her eyes were darting. She possessed a frantic, restless energy that I had never seen before. Near the end of the evening, I stepped away to use the restroom. On my way back, I saw Beatrice standing near the valet station. She had cornered the country club director. She was holding a thick white envelope. She pressed it into his hands, her voice low and urgent. At the time, I assumed it was a stack of cash for vendor tips. It is customary to tip the venue staff before the main event. But it was not cash. It was a physical check, a check she knew would take at least 12 hours to process through the banking system. She was buying time. The memory shifted forward to this morning. 6 hours ago. I was sitting in the bridal suite wrapped in a silk robe while a stylist pinned my hair. My mother had stepped out to find a steamer for my veil. When she did not return after 15 minutes, I walked out to the lobby to look for her. I did not find my mother. I found Preston. He was standing near the elevator banks with the same venue manager who was now pacing outside the kitchen. Preston did not look like a confident groom preparing for his wedding. He looked cornered. The manager was holding a piece of paper, gesturing sharply. Preston had his hands on his hips, his jaw tight, sweating through his custom dress shirt. I walked over and asked what was going on. The manager immediately stopped talking, offered a strange professional smile, and walked away. I looked Preston in the eye. I asked him if there was a problem with the venue. He did not meet my gaze. He looked over my shoulder, adjusting his expensive watch. He let out a patronizing sigh and told me it was just a minor logistical hiccup with the valet parking. He put his hands on my shoulders, turned me toward the hallway, and told me to go back to the suite and focus on your hair. Focus on your hair. He spoke to me the way you speak to a child interrupting a business meeting. He dismissed me entirely. He was hiding a massive financial failure, and he used my bridal anxiety as a convenient shield to keep me in the dark. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Beatrice's mood today had not shifted from condescending to cruel. It had shifted from condescending to desperate. The Caldwell firm was bleeding money. They were insolvent. This entire $150,000 wedding was not a celebration of our marriage. It was a desperate, high-stakes public relations stunt. The Caldwells needed the Harrison Group to inject fresh capital into their failing firm. They needed to project an image of untouchable wealth and stability. If the investors found out the Caldwells could not even afford to fund a dinner party, the firm would collapse by Monday morning. Everything clicked into place. The sudden seating chart changed the invisible barriers erected around my parents. Beatrice did not just want my parents out of the photographs because they were blue-collar. She needed them at the back of the room because she was terrified. She was terrified that if a mechanic and a bus driver sat at the VIP table, the investors might look too closely at the Caldwell's finances. She needed to surround herself with the illusion of money because the reality was bankrupt. Preston knew. He knew his family was broke. He knew his mother was writing bad checks. And he willingly participated in moving my parents to a folding table by the trash to protect his fake aristocracy. He was sacrificing my family's dignity to secure a corporate bailout. I stepped away from the kitchen doors. My hands were shaking not from sorrow, but from a cold, precise anger. In the dispatch center, anger is a useless emotion unless you channel it into action. You do not yell at a caller. You use the information they give you to build a response plan. I knew the Caldwells were broke. I knew the final check had bounced. But knowing a fact and proving a fact are two different things. If I confronted Preston right now without hard evidence, he would gaslight me. He would deploy his corporate charm, call me hysterical, and convince the room that I was having a bridal breakdown. I needed documentation. I needed the paper trail. Through the floral pillars, I watched the venue manager shake his head one last time. He told the wedding coordinator he was going to his office to call corporate security. He turned on his heel and marched down the carpeted hallway. The coordinator let out a ragged breath. She rubbed her temples, looking entirely defeated. She set her heavy leather clipboard down on a high-top cocktail table near the bar, pulled out her phone, and walked toward the terrace to make a private call. She left the clipboard unattended. The master clipboard, the logistical brain of the entire event. It contained every invoice, every seating arrangement, and every payment receipt for the last 8 months. The ballroom was still empty. The guests were outside on the lawn drinking champagne, completely unaware that the floor beneath them was caving in. The string quartet played a soft, classical melody that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. I smoothed the front of my ivory gown. I took a deep breath, regulating my heart rate back to a steady, operational rhythm. I walked away from table 18, leaving my parents' cheap place card sitting next to the garbage. I moved silently across the polished dance floor, keeping my eyes fixed on the leather clipboard resting on the cocktail table. The next conflict was waiting for me under that metal clip. I reached the high-top cocktail table. The leather clipboard sat there like an open ledger. My fingers brushed the metal clasp. I glanced toward the terrace. The coordinator was still pacing on the grass with a phone pressed to her ear. I had maybe 2 minutes before she returned. In my profession, gathering facts is the only way to survive a crisis. When a situation is rapidly deteriorating, you do not rely on assumptions. You look for the documentation. I opened the cover of the clipboard. I flipped past the floral arrangements and the lighting schematics. I bypassed the vendor contact sheets. I found the thick manila tab marked Accounting. I turned the page. The first document was a corporate check printed with the Caldwell Investment Firm logo. The paper was crisp. The amount written on the pay to the order line was $40,000. The memo line read, "Final catering deposit." Across the front of the check was a harsh red bank stamp, "Insufficient funds. Return to sender." So my instincts were correct. Beatrice Caldwell had handed over a worthless piece of paper at the rehearsal dinner. She gambled that the weekend bank processing delay would buy her enough time to get through the reception. She planned to serve the filet mignon to her wealthy investors tonight and deal with the financial fallout on Monday morning. She was using my wedding to project an image of wealth and stability that her family no longer possessed. But the venue manager had spoken in the past tense. He told the coordinator the final payment had not cleared yet. The kitchen staff was still plating the food. Why would a premium country club continue to serve $40,000 worth of luxury catering on a bounce check? Country clubs do not operate on charity. I lifted the voided Caldwell document. Stapled directly beneath it was a second receipt. It was a copy of a certified cashier's check. The bank heading did not belong to a private wealth management group. It belonged to the state employees' credit union. The amount was exactly $40,000. The processing date was stamped for yesterday afternoon, 4 hours before the rehearsal dinner. I scanned down to the signature line. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was a tight, slanted script, the same script I had seen on every birthday card, every math test, and every permission slip of my life. Tom Morgan, my father. I stood staring at the ink. The air in the ballroom seemed to grow cold. Tom Morgan does not have a trust fund. He does not play the stock market. He is a mechanic for the County Transit Authority. He earns his paycheck hour by hour underneath 10-ton utility trucks. I grew up watching him scrub grease out of his cuticles with gritty orange soap. I watched him wrap his aching knees in ice packs after a 12-hour shift in the winter. To generate $40,000 in liquid cash on a Friday afternoon, a man like my father has only one option. He had to liquidate a portion of his state retirement pension. He had to absorb the early withdrawal penalties, pay the immediate taxes, and drain the safety net he spent 3 decades building. The timeline formed a terrible, clear picture in my mind. The venue manager must have realized the Caldwell account was frozen earlier in the week. He likely tried to contact Preston or Beatrice. When they stalled or offered excuses, he went down the contact list on the main contract. He called my parents. My father did not call me to complain. He did not confront Preston. He did not demand recognition. He simply left his shift at the maintenance yard, walked into his credit union in his work boots, signed away years of his hard-earned retirement, and bought my wedding outright. He did it quietly so his daughter would not have to face the humiliation of a canceled reception. He absorbed the crisis so I could have a perfect day. He sat at the rehearsal dinner last night eating a cheap steak at the edge of the room. He watched Beatrice Caldwell parade around in a tailored suit drinking premium martinis and laughing with her elite friends. He watched her act like she owned the room, knowing full well he was the only reason the lights were still on, and he never said a single word. I gently closed the clipboard. The anger I felt earlier mutated into something far more dangerous. It crystallized. In the dispatch center, you hear a lot of terrible things. You hear fear, you hear pain, and sometimes you hear pure human malice. But the worst calls are the ones where someone takes advantage of a protector. Beatrice Caldwell was broke. My blue-collar father bailed out her high society event, And her response to his $40,000 lifeline was to move his chair next to a garbage can. She took his money to save her corporate image, then she hid him away behind the swinging kitchen doors so his calloused hands would not ruin the aesthetic for her investors. She used his life savings to fund a stage play designed to secure capital for her failing firm while treating him like an unwanted stray dog. And Preston knew. He had to know. The venue manager confronted him by the elevators this morning. Preston had looked cornered and sweaty. When I asked him what was wrong, he told me to focus on your hair. He let my father foot the bill for his family's financial fraud. He allowed my parents to be treated like an embarrassing afterthought, knowing they were the primary financiers of the entire evening. Preston chose to protect his mother's counterfeit kingdom over the dignity of the man who saved them both. I looked around the empty reception hall, the towering floral arrangements of white gardenias, the gold-rimmed charger plates, the crystal champagne flutes waiting to be filled. It was all paid for by a man who rebuilt diesel engines. It was paid for by early mornings, frozen fingers, and missed vacations. My father had purchased this room, and they told him he did not belong in it. I turned away from the cocktail table. I needed to find my fiancé. I needed to look him in the eye. The marriage was dead, but the execution of his reputation was just beginning. I would not allow my family to be used as a financial stepping stone and then discarded in the shadows. I began walking toward the foyer to locate the groom suite. I planned to hand him the voided check and watch his pristine facade crumble. As I moved toward the hallway, my satin skirt brushed against a small wooden welcome table near the main entrance. A neat stack of heavy ivory paper caught my attention. The wedding programs? The coordinator must have just set them out for the ushers to distribute to the arriving guests. I stopped. Something about the layout of the top page looked wrong. The symmetry was off. The text block was shifted too high. I reached down and picked one up. The betrayal I felt over the stolen money was about to pale in comparison to what they had put in print. I picked up the heavy ivory paper from the welcome table. The weight of it felt wrong in my hands. The textured surface was designed to mimic handmade parchment, a luxurious detail that cost an extra $4 per unit. $4 multiplied by 300 guests, $1,200 spent on paper alone paid for by the cashier's check. My father signed yesterday afternoon. I opened the folded document. The layout I had approved 3 weeks ago was gone. I had spent an hour sitting at my kitchen table formatting the text. I had placed a simple, elegant heading at the top of the second page, Parents of the Bride. Tom and Sarah Morgan, parents of the groom, Richard and Beatrice Caldwell. It was standard. It was respectful. The page staring back at me was a stranger. The words parents of the bride had been deleted entirely. They did not shift the names to the bottom. They did not reduce the font size. They excised my family from the document as if they never existed. In place of my parents' names sat a towering Caldwell family crest. The design featured 2 rearing lions flanking a stylized shield stamped in reflective gold foil. It was a fabricated emblem. The Caldwells did not inherit a noble coat of arms from centuries of European aristocracy. Richard Caldwell's grandfather sold aluminum siding in the 1950s before starting a local brokerage firm. They paid a graphic designer in downtown Raleigh to invent that crest last year. They used a fake coat of arms to literally cover up the names of the real people who paid for the printing. I scanned further down the page. Beneath the gold lions, the text shifted into a dedication section. It was not a thank you to the aunts and uncles who traveled across the country to be here. It did not mention the childhood friends who took time off work to celebrate. It read like a corporate brochure. With special appreciation to our sponsoring partners, the Harrison Group, Apex Capital Holdings, the Vanguard Equity Trust. My heart slowed to a steady, methodical rhythm. They had transformed a sacred ceremony into a shareholder meeting. They turned my wedding program into a prospectus, a pitch deck designed to secure their next round of funding. The strategy was breathtaking in its cruelty. Beatrice knew the investors at Table 1 would skim the program before the salad course arrived. If they saw the name Morgan listed under the bridal party, someone might ask questions. Someone might wonder who the Morgans were. They might inquire about my father's business portfolio. They might discover he repairs city buses for a living. Beatrice could not risk a single crack in the high society mirror, so she sanitized the paperwork. She scrubbed the working class out of the timeline. If an investor picked up this program, they would assume I was an orphan, or perhaps a distant cousin of another wealthy lineage too complex to list. They would never know a mechanic drained his retirement fund to buy the filet mignon they were about to cut into. I thought about my father's hands. When he finishes rebuilding a commercial diesel engine, he takes a small metal tag, stamps his initials into it, and bolts it to the manifold. He signs his work. He takes ownership of the labor, the grease, and the long hours. He wants the next mechanic who opens that hood to know Tom Morgan did the job correctly. He operates on genuine pride. The Caldwells operate on counterfeit optics. They hide their bounced checks and frozen accounts behind gold foil lions and stolen prestige. They were happy to take $40,000 of blue-collar cash, but they refused to let the man who provided it print his name on a piece of folded paper. The physical insult of Table 18 was terrible. Sitting my parents next to a foot-pedal trash can was a cruel display of arrogance, but this program was something far worse. A seating chart only lasts for one evening. A wedding program is a historical record. Guests take them home. They slide them into scrapbooks. They leave them on coffee tables. Beatrice had legally and socially erased my parents from the official record of my life. She wanted no proof that we had ever merged our lives. She wanted all the financial benefits of my father's sacrifice without any of the social association. The temperature in the foyer seemed to drop. The ambient noise of the string quartet warming up on the terrace faded into a dull hum. In the emergency dispatch center, we use a specific protocol. When a caller is trapped in a burning structure, you stop asking them how they feel. You give them direct, actionable commands. Find a window. Break the glass. Get out. The emotional shock was over. The grief of losing the man I thought I loved evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, tactical focus. I was trapped in a burning structure. The Caldwell family was a house on fire sustained only by the fuel of my father's stolen retirement fund. I needed to break the glass. I closed the program. The crisp edge of the heavy paper dug into my palm. I did not throw it away. I rolled it into a tight cylinder and gripped it like a baton. It was no longer a piece of stationery. It was physical evidence of their fraud. I turned away from the welcome table. The main corridor stretched out in front of me, lined with framed oil paintings and brass sconces. At the far end of the hall sat the groom's suite. The heavy oak door was closed, guarding the men inside. I walked down the corridor. My satin heels hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, rhythmic snap. I did not look at the floral arrangements. I did not acknowledge the venue staff scurrying past with trays of glassware. My peripheral vision narrowed until the only thing in my sightline was that oak door. Preston was inside that room. He was adjusting his tailored tuxedo. He was preparing to walk down the aisle and play the role of the successful young executive marrying the beautiful frontline worker. He was ready to smile for the cameras, shake hands with the Harrison Group, and sign a marriage license that would bind me to his family's sinking ship. He thought I was in the bridal suite, focusing on my hair, just like he ordered me to do. He thought I was a naive, exhausted dispatcher who would simply smile and pose while his mother treated my family like disposable walking bank accounts. He assumed I would prioritize the aesthetic of the wedding over the dignity of my own blood. He severely underestimated the woman he asked to marry him. I reached the end of the hallway. I did not knock. I did not hesitate. I reached out, grabbed the brass handle, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The conversation waiting for me inside that room was about to dictate the rest of my life. The illusion was over. The reckoning was here. The heavy oak door swung inward. The air inside the groom's suite hit me like a physical wall. It smelled of cedarwood, spilled scotch, and expensive aftershave. The room was a sanctuary of curated masculine luxury. Leather armchairs sat clustered around a low mahogany coffee table littered with crystal tumblers and silver flasks. 4 groomsmen were lounging on the sofas, laughing at a joke I did not hear. In the center of the room stood Preston. He was positioned in front of a floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror. His tuxedo jacket hung over the back of a chair. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the luxury watch his parents bought him for his promotion. He had his chin tipped up carefully, adjusting the knot of his black silk bow tie. When the door clicked shut behind me, the laughter in the room died. 5 heads turned in my direction. Preston dropped his hands from his collar. He looked at my face, then down at my ivory gown. A practiced, easy smile slid onto his face. He took a step forward, holding his hands out in a gesture of playful reprimand. He told me it was terrible luck for the bride to see the groom before the ceremony. He used his smooth hosting voice, the one designed to charm clients and diffuse mild social tension. I did not smile back. I looked at the 4 men sitting on the leather couches. I used the exact tone I use when a bystander is interfering with an active emergency scene. It is a voice devoid of emotion, operating purely on authority. I told them to get out. The groomsmen hesitated. They looked at Preston for confirmation. I did not wait for his permission. I took a step further into the room and repeated the command. The temperature in the suite dropped. The 4 men set their glasses down, grabbed their suit jackets in silence, and shuffled out the door. The latch clicked behind them, sealing Preston and me inside the room. Preston let out a soft chuckle, though his eyes remained guarded. He picked up his crystal tumbler from the vanity counter, took a slow sip of amber liquid, and asked me why I was acting like a drill sergeant on our wedding day. I walked over to the mahogany coffee table. I unrolled the stiff ivory wedding program I had been gripping in my fist. I placed it face up on the polished wood. I stepped back, keeping my posture straight and my hands empty. I asked him to explain the seating arrangement at table 18. Preston's smile faltered just a fraction of an inch, but enough to show the seams. He set his drink down. He did not look at the program on the table. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, turning his head slightly to check his jawline. He waved a hand in the air, a dismissive flick of his wrist. He told me his mother handled the floor plan. He said there were last-minute changes with the caterers, and a few tables had to be shuffled to accommodate the service flow. He recited the excuse with the fluid rhythm of a man who had rehearsed the lie. I did not let him finish the prepared script. I told him table 18 was a plastic folding table next to a trash can. I told him the chairs did not have cushions. I told him the swinging kitchen doors were going to hit my father in the spine every time a waiter carried a tray of food out to his wealthy investors. Preston stopped inspecting his reflection. He turned to face me. The charm evaporated. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me, not as a bride, but as an unreasonable client making impossible demands. He let out a heavy, drawn-out sigh, the kind of sigh a person uses when they are forced to deal with an unruly child. He told me I was overreacting. He said we had 300 guests to manage, and he could not micromanage every single chair. He told me not to cause drama right before the ceremony. Do not cause drama. The ultimate silencer. The phrase abusers use when you refuse to quietly accept their disrespect. I kept my voice low and steady. I pointed to the printed program on the table. I told him his mother did not just shuffle a few chairs. I told him she erased my parents' names from the record. I told him she replaced the people who gave me life with a fake gold crest and a list of corporate sponsors. Preston ran a hand through his styled hair. He took a step toward me, adopting a tone of deep, patronizing patience. He told me I did not understand the corporate stakes. He admitted his mother had to format the program to highlight the primary investors. He said the Harrison Group needed to see their names prioritized for optics. I watched his mouth move. He was defending the erasure of my family as a necessary business transaction. I delivered the final piece of evidence. I told him I saw the clipboard. I told him I saw the voided check from Caldwell Investments. I told him I knew his mother tried to pay the venue with an unfunded account, and I knew my father drained $40,000 from his retirement yesterday to save the reception from being canceled. For the first time since I walked into the suite, Preston looked genuinely startled. His posture stiffened. The color drained from his face, leaving his tan looking artificial and sallow. He uncrossed his arms. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then swallowed hard. He did not deny it. He could not deny it. The silence stretched between us. I waited for the shame to hit him. I waited for him to apologize, to break down, to express some level of horror that his family had stolen my father's life savings and then shoved him next to a garbage bin. The shame never came. Instead, Preston squared his shoulders. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, pragmatic calculation. He treated the exposed fraud not as a moral failure, but as a leak in a corporate merger that simply needed to be managed. He lowered his voice, speaking in a rapid, hushed tone. He told me the firm was experiencing a temporary liquidity issue. He said the market had shifted and their assets were tied up in escrow. He framed the bounced check as a clerical timing error. He told me the Harrison Group was preparing to inject $10 million of fresh capital into Caldwell Investments next week. He said this wedding was the final pitch. They needed to project absolute financial dominance to close the deal. He took a step closer, reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back. He dropped his hand, looking annoyed. He told me my dad was a practical man. He said my father understood how the real world worked. Preston looked me dead in the eye and said my parents were tough. He said people like Tom and Sarah Morgan did not care about velvet cushions or fancy programs. He said they were used to rough conditions. He told me my parents would be happy to sit in the back of the room if it meant securing our financial future. He demanded I play along. He told me to put on my veil, walk down the aisle, and smile for the cameras. He promised he would pay my father back with interest once the Harrison deal closed. He told me to stop dwelling on minor seating issues and focus on the big picture. I stood perfectly still. The man standing in front of me was a ghost. The Preston I thought I knew. The grounded partner who brought me coffee during my night shifts had never existed. He was a hologram projected by a desperate family. He did not see my father as a hero who saved his wedding. He saw my father as a disposable pack mule, a source of emergency funding who lacked the social pedigree to be seen in the photographs. Preston chose his mother's fraudulent optics. He chose the fake gold crest. He chose the illusion of wealth over the dignity of the people who actually possessed true character. The romantic facade shattered, leaving behind nothing but cold architecture. The marriage died right there on the Persian rug of the groom's suite. It did not die with screaming or thrown glasses. It died with the quiet, clinical realization that I was standing in a room with a predator. I did not argue with him. Arguing requires a desire to reach an understanding. I had no desire to understand him anymore. I had gathered the intel. I had confirmed the threat. Now it was time to execute the response plan. I looked at Preston one last time. I told him I was going to fix my hair. I turned my back on him. I walked to the heavy oak door, grabbed the brass handle, and pulled it open. I stepped out of the suite and let the door shut behind me, sealing him inside his counterfeit world. I stood in the long, quiet corridor lined with oil paintings. My pulse was a steady drumbeat. I needed to find my maid of honor and secure the legal paperwork. But as I took my first step down the patterned carpet, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from the cross hallway ahead. I stopped. I stepped back, pressing my shoulders into the shallow alcove of a large floral arrangement. I waited in the shadows as a familiar voice cut through the silence of the corridor, delivering the final piece of the execution narrative. I pressed my spine against the cool plaster of the hallway alcove. The alcove was deep enough to conceal me, shadowed by a towering arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus resting on a marble pedestal. The scent of the eucalyptus was sharp and medicinal. It grounded me. It gave me something to focus on besides the adrenaline flooding my system. I heard the heavy oak door of the groom's suite click open just seconds after I had walked away. Preston had stepped out into the corridor. He was likely heading toward the terrace to play the role of the confident host, eager to shake hands with the men whose money he desperately needed. But his footsteps stopped abruptly. A second set of footsteps was marching rapidly down the intersecting hallway. The sound was distinct, the sharp, staccato click of designer heels striking the hardwood floor. The rhythm was uneven, lacking the usual measured grace of a high society matriarch. It was Beatrice. I held my breath and leaned deeper into the shadows. Through the thick foliage of the floral arrangement, I had a clear line of sight to the intersection of the corridors. Beatrice rounded the corner and nearly collided with her son. She did not look like the woman who had spent the last 8 months dictating my life. Beatrice Caldwell was famous in her social circles for her flawless composure. She was a woman who chaired silent auctions, hosted charity luncheons at the country club, and navigated complex social dynamics without ever wrinkling her silk blouses or raising her voice. She projected an aura of effortless, untouchable wealth. The woman standing in the hallway right now was unraveling. Her breathing was shallow and fast. She was clutching her silver evening bag so tightly her knuckles were stark white against her tan skin. A thin sheen of perspiration was visible on her forehead, ruining the matte finish of her expensive makeup. The financial ruin of her family was a heavy, invisible weight, and it was finally crushing her posture. She reached out and grabbed Preston's forearm, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of his tailored tuxedo jacket. She did not bother with pleasantries. She asked him, in a brittle, frantic whisper, if the situation was under control. She demanded to know if he had spoken to me about the seating chart. I watched Preston's face. He did not look surprised by her panic. He looked like a co-conspirator. He gently pried her fingers off his sleeve and smoothed the fabric of his jacket. He nodded, keeping his voice low and soothing, adopting the tone of a crisis manager handling a volatile client. He told his mother that he had just finished speaking with me. He said I was upset, but he had managed the fallout. He assured her I was heading back to the bridal suite to fix my hair and prepare for the ceremony. Beatrice did not look relieved. Her eyes darted down the empty hallway, terrified that an investor might wander inside and overhear them. She stepped closer to Preston, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous hiss. She told him the Harrison group had just arrived on the terrace. She said Jim Harrison brought 2 senior partners from his firm. She stressed that these men were meticulous, and they noticed everything. The $10 million capital injection was riding on this evening. The Caldwell investment firm needed to look like a fortress of prosperity. Then she brought up my family. She told Preston he needed to make certain my parents stayed in the back of the room for the duration of the night. She referred to my father as a grease-stained liability. She said if Jim Harrison saw a city mechanic and a bus driver sitting in the VIP section, the optics would destroy the merger. She said the investors would start asking questions about my family's portfolio. They would wonder why the Caldwells were associating with blue-collar workers. They would smell the desperation. She looked her son in the eye and stated with chilling conviction that my parents did not belong in this building. She said they did not belong in her world. The hypocrisy was staggering. She was standing in a venue paid for by the very mechanic she was insulting. She was relying on the charity of a working-class man to keep her counterfeit aristocracy from collapsing into bankruptcy. She took his money to fund her stage play, and now she was demanding he stay hidden in the shadows so he would not ruin the aesthetic of her fraud. I waited for Preston to flinch. I waited for him to show a single shred of human decency. I waited for him to remind his mother that the grease-stained liability had bailed them out of a $40,000 deficit just yesterday. Preston did none of those things. He offered his mother a compliant, reassuring nod. He told her she was right. He said the optics were the only priority tonight. He promised her that the Morgans would remain at table 18 out of sight and out of mind. He told his mother to go back out to the terrace. He instructed her to order the waiters to pour the vintage champagne to find Jim Harrison, and to smile. He said he handled the naive dispatcher. He said everything was going to go exactly according to their plan. Beatrice exhaled a long, shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a brief second, visibly gathering her fractured composure. She smoothed the front of her designer gown, lifted her chin, and transformed back into the wealthy, untouchable matriarch. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the terrace, her footsteps returning to their measured, confident rhythm. Preston watched her go. He adjusted his bow tie one last time in the reflection of a framed landscape painting, turned and headed toward the groomsmen's staging area. I remained in the alcove long after the hallway was empty. A normal bride would have collapsed onto the floor. A normal bride would have ruined her makeup with tears hyperventilated and called her mother to beg for a way out of the nightmare. I did not shed a single tear. My chest did not heave. My hands did not shake. In the dispatch center, there is a distinct physiological shift that occurs when a routine domestic disturbance escalates into a hostage situation. The ambient noise fades. The peripheral vision tunnels. The emotional processing center of the brain shuts down, allowing pure tactical logic to take over. You stop reacting to the horror of the situation, and you start calculating the geometry of the escape route. My heart froze with the cold, clinical clarity of a professional taking control of a chaotic scene. Preston and Beatrice believed they had neutralized the threat. They believed they controlled the board because they controlled the seating chart, the venue, and the guest list. They looked at me and saw a naive, exhausted first responder who was too intimidated by their wealth to fight back. They assumed I would swallow the disrespect to preserve the peace. They were operating on a flawed premise. They thought I was a civilian trapped in their crisis. They did not realize they had just handed a loaded weapon to a crisis manager. I stepped out of the alcove. The heavy scent of the eucalyptus followed me into the corridor. I had gathered the intelligence. I had confirmed the motives. I had witnessed the confession. Now I needed a tactical advantage. Confronting Preston in front of his mother right now would achieve nothing. They would deny the conversation. They would gaslight me in front of the venue staff. They would use their social influence to paint me as an unstable woman buckling under the pressure of a high society event. I could not fight a financial fraud with an emotional argument. I needed leverage. I needed a structural weakness in their plan. I reviewed the timeline of the upcoming ceremony. The guests would be seated in 15 minutes. The string quartet would play the processional. Preston and I would stand in front of 300 people and exchange vows. We would trade rings. The officiant would pronounce us husband and wife. But vows and rings are just theater. They are symbolic gestures designed for an audience. They do not carry the weight of the law. In the state of North Carolina, a marriage is not recognized by the government until a specific piece of paper is signed by the bride, the groom, the officiant, and 2 witnesses. That paper is the marriage license. Beatrice had insisted on a very specific piece of theater for the reception. She wanted to showcase the merging of our lives as a prime photo opportunity for the country club photographer. She had arranged for the official signing of the marriage license to take place after the dinner service right before the cake cutting. She wanted Preston and me to sit at the sweetheart table and sign the document in front of the cheering crowd, which meant the marriage license was currently unsigned. It was sitting on a mahogany desk in the bridal suite, resting inside a leather folio provided by the wedding coordinator. It was a blank contract. Legally, I was a free woman. I was not bound to Preston. I was not tied to the insolvent Caldwell investment firm. I was not tethered to their fraudulent debts or their bounced checks. The only thing keeping me in this venue was a white dress and a timeline. I did not need to run away from the country club in tears. I needed to execute a controlled demolition of their reputation. I needed to let them sit down at their VIP table, surround themselves with the investors they were trying to con, and serve the food my father paid for. I needed to wait until the audience was a captive one, but I could not do it alone. I needed an accomplice to secure the perimeter and confirm the legal parameters of my escape plan. I needed someone who understood corporate litigation and contract law just as well as the men sitting at table 1. I turned away from the terrace and walked swiftly toward the bridal suite. I needed to find my maid of honor. Jessica was not just my best friend from college. She was a senior paralegal at a ruthless corporate law firm in downtown Raleigh. She spent her weekdays dismantling fraudulent contracts and finding the hidden clauses in bad deals. The Caldwells thought they were running a brilliant corporate scam. They were about to find out what happens when you try to scam a dispatcher and a paralegal. I pushed open the door to the bridal suite and let it shut behind me. The room was a stark contrast to the quiet tension of the hallway. It was bright and cluttered with the aftermath of a bridal party preparation. Empty champagne flutes littered the vanity counters. Discarded makeup brushes and half-empty cans of hairspray rested next to expensive garment bags. In the center of the room stood Jessica. She was adjusting the strap of her emerald green maid of honor gown. Jessica and I met during our freshman year at North Carolina State University. We shared a cramped dormitory and survived on cheap coffee and sheer ambition. While I pursued emergency communications, Jessica set her sights on the legal field. She is now a senior paralegal at a premier corporate litigation firm in downtown Raleigh. She spends her workdays analyzing breached contracts, uncovering hidden liabilities, and shielding her clients from predatory business practices. She evaluates every situation in terms of risk and leverage. There was no better person on earth to have in this room right now. A hotel attendant was kneeling near the sofa, packing tissue paper into a cardboard box. I walked past Jessica, approached the attendant, and handed her a $20 bill. I kept my voice polite but firm. I told her we needed the room cleared immediately and asked her to take her break early. The attendant looked at my face, nodded quickly, and slipped out the door. I reached over and turned the brass deadbolt. The lock engaged with a loud, heavy click. Jessica stopped adjusting her dress. She knows me too well. She heard the lock click and recognized the shift in my posture. She set her evening clutch down on the table. She did not ask me if I was nervous about walking down the aisle. She took one look at my eyes and knew we were dealing with an active threat. I gave her the facts. In the dispatch center, we call this a rapid debrief. I did not waste time crying or pacing the floor. I delivered the timeline of the last 30 minutes in short, precise sentences. I told her the Caldwell investment account was frozen. I told her the venue had rejected their corporate check. I explained that my father had secretly liquidated his pension to cover the catering bill just yesterday. Finally, I told her about the seating arrangement at table 18 and the conversation I had just overheard in the hallway. Jessica did not gasp. She did not offer me useless pity or tell me everything was going to be fine. She processed the information with the cold calculation of a legal professional reviewing a hostile takeover. Her jaw tightened. She looked toward the mahogany desk in the corner of the room. Resting on the polished wood was a slim navy blue leather folio. The wedding coordinator had left it there an hour ago. We both walked over to the desk. Jessica opened the folio. Inside sat the official North Carolina marriage license. It was a single sheet of watermarked paper issued by the Wake County Register of Deeds. It contained my full legal name, Preston's name, and our birth dates. Below our information were several blank lines designated for signatures: the bride, the groom, the officiant, 2 witnesses. Beatrice Caldwell had insisted on treating this document as a prop. She had coordinated a schedule where Preston and I would sit at the sweetheart table during the dessert course, surrounded by photographers, and sign the paper in front of the cheering investors. She wanted a perfect, pristine photo opportunity to cap off her counterfeit high society event. Because of her obsession with optics, the document remained entirely blank. Jessica ran her manicured finger along the empty signature lines. She looked up at me. Her voice was sharp and clear, cutting through the heavy air of the suite. She explained the legal reality of my situation. She told me that a wedding ceremony in this state is nothing more than a social performance. The expensive dresses, the spoken vows, the exchanged rings, and the pronouncement by the minister carry zero legal weight without this specific piece of paper. The state requires the signed document to be returned to the county courthouse within 60 days to register the union. If those lines remain blank, the marriage does not exist. Jessica looked me directly in the eyes. She told me that if I did not put ink on this page, I was legally untouchable. I would not share a last name with Preston Caldwell. I would not be tethered to his family's insolvent firm. I would not be held liable for their mounting corporate debts, their bounced checks, or their fraudulent business practices. There would be no messy divorce proceedings. There would be no need for an annulment. There would be no division of assets or lengthy court battles. If I refused to sign this paper, I could walk out of the country club as a free, independent citizen. I would walk away clean. The shift in power was sudden and complete. 10 minutes ago, I felt like a trapped victim caught in a web of wealthy manipulators. Now I realized I was holding the ultimate leverage. I was not a helpless bride waiting to be sacrificed for a capital investment deal. I was an undercover operative holding the launch codes to their entire destruction. Preston and Beatrice needed this marriage to finalize their image of stability for the Harrison Group. They needed my signature to seal the illusion. They were waiting for me to step into the reception, play my role, and bind myself to their sinking ship. I closed the leather folio. I looked at Jessica and formulated the extraction plan. I told her we were moving to the tactical phase. I pointed to my overnight bag resting near the closet. The venue staff was supposed to transport our luggage to the honeymoon suite at the end of the night. I instructed Jessica to gather my belongings immediately. I told her to pack her own bags as well. I needed all our personal items out of the bridal suite before the reception started. Next, I outlined the escape route. The front entrance of the country club would be crowded with valet attendants and lingering guests. We needed a secure, unmonitored exit. I told Jessica to take the service elevator down to the ground floor. I told her to drive her car around the perimeter of the property and park it at the loading dock near the kitchen entrance. The loading dock was directly adjacent to table 18. It was the perfect extraction point for my parents and me. Jessica nodded. She moved with swift efficiency. She grabbed my duffel bag, zipped it shut, and slung her purse over her shoulder. She told me she would have the car running and waiting in the service alley. She gave my hand one firm squeeze, an unspoken promise of solidarity, and slipped out the door. I was alone in the room. I walked over to the full-length mirror. I looked at my reflection. I was wearing a custom ivory gown. My hair was styled in an intricate twist. I looked like the perfect, compliant addition to the Caldwell family portfolio. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully hidden my working-class parents in the shadows. They thought their financial fraud was safe. They had no idea they had just invited their own executioner to the party. A sharp knock echoed through the room. I turned away from the mirror. The brass handle turned, and the wedding coordinator peeked her head inside. She offered a strained, tight smile, clearly still rattled by her earlier conversation with the venue manager. She told me the guests were seated. The string quartet was ready to play the entrance music. She said Preston was waiting for me in the foyer. It was time for the grand entrance. I picked up my bouquet of white gardenias. I took one final steady breath, regulating my pulse. I told the coordinator I was ready. I walked out of the suite and headed toward the main hall. I was about to stand next to the man I intended to destroy, look into the eyes of 300 guests, and deliver a performance they would never forget. I met Preston in the grand foyer just outside the main reception hall. He was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, projecting the image of a relaxed and successful groom. The corridor was empty, save for the event coordinator hovering near the entrance. When I approached, Preston turned and extended his arm for me to take. I looked at the dark fabric of his tuxedo sleeve. Less than an hour ago, I had watched his mother dig her manicured fingers into that exact spot while demanding my parents be hidden from view. I rested my hand lightly on his forearm. His skin felt foreign beneath the material. The man I had loved was gone, replaced by a hostile actor playing a role in a corporate stage play. He leaned in and whispered that we were about to make a perfect entrance. He smelled of expensive cologne and quiet desperation. I did not reply. I simply adjusted my posture, locked my jaw, and prepared to breach the room. The heavy mahogany doors swung outward. The master of ceremonies announced our names through the high-fidelity sound system. 300 guests rose to their feet. The string quartet transitioned into an upbeat classical piece that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. We stepped across the threshold. The applause washed over us, loud and resonant, filling the cavernous space. I did not experience the moment the way a bride should. I did not feel a rush of joy or a sense of overwhelming love. I surveyed the room with the clinical detachment of a dispatcher taking an aerial view of a crisis zone. In my profession, you learn to map a hazard area within seconds. You catalog the exits. You note the placement of the bystanders. You identify the primary targets. We walked down the center aisle, moving slowly through the sea of cheering attendees. The photographer walked backward in front of us, the camera flash blindingly bright. Preston waved to his college friends. He smiled at his fraternity brothers. I maintained a fixed ceramic smile. I acknowledged the guests without truly seeing them. My focus was locked on the two opposing gravitational centers of the ballroom. Table 1 sat directly adjacent to the dance floor, bathed in the soft glow of dedicated pin spot lighting. It was the epicenter of the Caldwell illusion. Beatrice sat in the center seat flanked by her husband Richard and the 3 senior partners of the Harrison Group. She was holding court with effortless precision. She leaned her head back in practiced laughter, lightly touching the arm of the lead investor, Jim Harrison. The setup at Table 1 was flawless. The table was draped in heavy custom linens that touched the hardwood floor. Towering crystal vases held imported orchids that cost more than my first car. Waiters hovered constantly nearby, ensuring the vintage champagne never dropped below the halfway mark in any crystal flute. The guests at Table 1 were dining off gold-rimmed charger plates. They were reading from the fraudulent printed programs featuring the fabricated family crest. They looked comfortable. They looked powerful. They were entirely insulated from the reality that their luxury experience was funded by stolen blue-collar retirement money. Preston guided me past their section. Beatrice caught my eye as we walked by. She offered a brief approving nod, believing I had been successfully subdued. She thought her crisis management tactics had worked, and the naive dispatcher had fallen into line. She turned her attention back to the investors eager to secure their capital before the night ended. I shifted my gaze past the crystal centerpieces, past the tiered wedding cake, and past the crowded middle section of the room. I looked to the far corner of the venue, past the dim glow of the exit sign to Table 18. My parents were sitting side by side at the plastic folding table. The visual contrast hit me like a physical strike to the chest. My father was wearing his only good suit. He had purchased it off the rack 5 years ago for a relative's funeral. The jacket was slightly tight across his broad shoulders, built by decades of pulling engine blocks and replacing commercial tires. He had polished his own shoes this morning with a kitchen rag. He sat ramrod straight, radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity. He was not looking around the wealthy room with envy. He was not complaining about his seat. He was looking directly at me as I walked down the aisle, his eyes filled with quiet pride. Next to him, my mother was attempting to unfold her cheap linen napkin. She was wearing a dress she bought on clearance 6 months ago, having spent her extra money on my bridal accessories. As she smoothed the thin fabric over her lap, the aluminum kitchen doors swung open with a harsh metallic squeak. A waiter rushed out carrying a large plastic bus tub filled with dirty appetizer plates. The waiter collided with the rubber scraping station located mere inches behind my mother's chair. The sound of ceramic dishes crashing together echoed sharply over the string quartet. My mother flinched, pulling her shoulders up to her ears, startled by the sudden sharp noise. My father did not yell at the waiter. He did not stand up and demand a better table. He simply reached under the uneven folding table and placed his large, grease-stained hand over my mother's shaking fingers. He anchored her. He absorbed the indignity so she would not feel alone. Seeing my father comfort my mother in that dark, noisy corner triggered a deep physiological response. The protective instinct I used to guide terrified callers through late-night emergencies turned inward. The man who paid for the orchids, the champagne, and the filet mignon was currently absorbing the noise of a dish pit so I could have a beautiful evening. He was enduring the ultimate disrespect with total grace. The emotional pressure cooker inside my chest reached maximum capacity. I felt the heat rising in my throat, but I did not let the anger break my composure. I refined it. I tightened my grip on Preston's arm just enough to let him feel the pressure of my fingers through his jacket sleeve. We reached the sweetheart table situated on a raised platform at the front of the room. We took our seats. Preston immediately unbuttoned his suit jacket and exhaled. He slouched slightly in his chair, believing the hard part was over. He looked out at his wealthy guests and smiled, confident that his counterfeit kingdom was secure. He did not notice the navy blue leather folio resting on the corner of our table. The blank marriage license was waiting right next to my water glass. The guests were taking their seats. The master of ceremonies asked everyone to prepare for the first course. The waiters began circulating the room with heavy silver trays. The ballroom settled into a steady hum of polite dinner conversation. The trap was fully set. I sat still, watching the room, waiting for the timeline to unfold. And then I saw Beatrice stand up from table 1. She picked up her champagne flute and began walking across the room, her eyes fixed on the back corner. The spark was moving toward the powder keg. The culinary team at the Oakwood Country Club operates with military precision. The mahogany doors leading from the main kitchen swung open in perfect synchronization. A procession of waiters emerged, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with the first course. They dispersed across the ballroom floor, moving silently between the round tables. They placed shallow porcelain bowls in front of the seated guests. The dish was a roasted butternut squash bisque, garnished with toasted pumpkin seeds and a drizzle of truffle oil. It was an elegant presentation. It was also an item that cost $45 per serving. I sat at the sweetheart table and looked down at the pale orange liquid resting in front of me. I did not pick up my silver spoon. I did not feel hungry. I looked at the bowl and saw the direct translation of my father's labor. I saw the early morning shifts in the freezing rain. I saw the overtime hours logged in the county maintenance garage. My father had paid for 300 of these porcelain bowls. He had funded the truffle oil and the silver spoons. Preston sat next to me. He was leaning back in his velvet-upholstered chair with his legs crossed at the ankle. He had one arm draped casually over the backrest. His other hand held a crystal tumbler of sparkling water. He was engaged in a lively conversation with one of his fraternity brothers seated at the nearest table. He was smiling. He looked entirely at ease. He believed the crisis was managed. He thought he had successfully cornered me in the groom's suite and secured my compliance. He was resting comfortably inside his illusion. Down at table 1, the primary investors were enjoying their meals. Jim Harrison nodded approvingly as he tasted the bisque. Beatrice sat adjacent to him. She held a long-stemmed wine glass, taking careful, delicate sips to avoid ruining her lipstick. She placed the glass back onto a custom-embossed coaster. Then she stood up. She smoothed the front of her tailored designer gown. She leaned over and offered a practiced, gracious smile to the investors, excusing herself from the conversation. She began walking across the ballroom floor. She did not take the direct route toward the lobby doors. She took the long, scenic path. She weaved through the tables. She stopped to place a gentle hand on a guest's shoulder here, or leaned down to exchange a brief pleasantry there. She was working the room. She was projecting the image of the generous, wealthy hostess presiding over a flawless high society event. Her path took her deeper into the venue. She moved past the polished wood of the center dance floor and approached the outer perimeter of the room. She was heading toward the back hallway where the private country club restrooms were located. That specific route required her to walk directly past the service entrance. It required her to walk past table 18. I tracked her movement from my elevated vantage point. In the communication center, you learn to monitor a developing situation by watching the trajectory of a known threat. Beatrice was a moving hazard. Table 18 sat in the dim shadows of the exit sign. My parents were eating their soup in silence. My mother had her small beaded purse resting securely in her lap. She kept her elbows tucked in close to her body, trying to take up as little physical space as possible. The plastic folding chair she sat on was unstable. Every time she shifted her weight, the metal legs scraped lightly against the hardwood floor. She was trying to be invisible. Beatrice approached the back corner. She was looking over her shoulder, waving a manicured hand to an associate seated near the bar. She was not paying attention to the tight clearance between table 18 and the aluminum kitchen doors. A waiter pushed through those double doors at that exact second. He was carrying a large plastic bus tub loaded with empty appetizer plates. The door swung outward. The metal edge caught the back of my mother's folding chair. The sudden impact jolted my mother forward. Her knee hit the underside of the flimsy plastic table. The table shifted a few inches and bumped directly into Beatrice. It was a minor collision. A simple physical chain reaction caused by severe overcrowding in a designated service area. No water spilled, no porcelain shattered. The waiter immediately stepped back, lowered his head, and offered a quiet, frantic apology. Beatrice did not accept the apology. She did not direct her frustration at the waiter. She did not acknowledge the poorly designed floor plan she had personally orchestrated. She directed her anger at the easiest target in the room. She looked down at my mother. The polite, wealthy hostess smile vanished instantly. Her face hardened into a mask of pure aristocratic disdain. She brushed her hand against the side of her gown as if the fabric had been infected by the contact. She let out a sharp, audible sigh. The sound carried over the low hum of the surrounding dinner conversations. She leaned down slightly, invading my mother's personal space. She kept her voice just loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear every single syllable. "Watch your chair, Sarah. Some of us are wearing actual silk." She did not yell. She delivered the insult with a lethal casualness. It was a verbal strike designed to remind my mother of her exact place in the hierarchy. It was a reminder that her clearance rack dress and her bus driver salary made her a clumsy inconvenience to the people who mattered. The surrounding tables fell silent. The guests seated at tables 16 and 17 stopped eating. They lowered their spoons. They looked at Beatrice. They looked at my mother. They witnessed the targeted cruelty, and they said nothing. They lowered their eyes back to their porcelain bowls, remaining complicit in the humiliation. My mother shrank. Her shoulders caved inward. She dropped her gaze to her lap, staring intently at her hands. Her cheeks flushed a deep, painful red. She did not defend herself. She had spent her entire life working hard and treating people with quiet kindness. She did not possess the toxic vocabulary required to fight back against country club venom. I shifted my eyes to my father. Tom Morgan sat frozen. His large hands were resting flat on either side of his soup bowl. His knuckles were bone white. The muscles in his jaw flexed tight and rigid. I saw the protective instinct flare in his eyes. I knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to push the flimsy folding table aside, look that woman in the face, and demand basic human respect for his wife. But he did not move. He swallowed his pride. He forced his hands to remain flat on the table. He endured the insult of the woman who was currently spending his stolen retirement money. He stayed silent because he looked across the room and saw me sitting at the sweetheart table. He chose to absorb the public degradation because he believed that fighting back would ruin my wedding day. He was letting them break his spirit to protect my illusion of happiness. The string quartet continued to play their classical melodies. The waiters continued to pour chilled water. Beatrice turned on her heel and continued her walk toward the restroom, her posture triumphant. She had successfully asserted her dominance. She believed she had put the working-class strays back in their designated place. I sat on the raised platform overlooking the room. I felt a distinct shift in my biology. The ambient noise of the reception hall faded into a dull, distant hum. The clinking silverware, the music, the low chatter of 300 guests all dropped away. My vision narrowed. The peripheral details of the room blurred until the only thing in sharp focus was the image of my father staring at his hands in defeat. In the dispatch center, there is a crucial threshold. It is the moment you transition from gathering information to deploying the response. You stop listening to the background static and you dispatch the units. The assessment phase is over. The action phase begins. The spark had finally reached the powder keg. I placed my hands flat on the polished edges of the sweetheart table. I did not rush. I executed the movement with deliberate mechanical precision. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped heavily against the raised platform. The sound was harsh and grating. It cut straight through the polite, curated atmosphere of the room. Preston snapped his head toward me. He had been laughing at a joke from the next table. His smile dropped. He looked at my face and recognized the drastic shift in my demeanor. He saw the cold operational focus in my eyes. He leaned toward me. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was tight and urgent. He kept his voice low, hissing the words through his teeth so the nearby guests would not hear. He asked me what I was doing. He told me to sit down immediately. He said the photographer was about to come over for the dinner portraits. He ordered me to stop causing a scene. He was still trying to manage the optics. He was still trying to protect the investment capital. He thought he could issue a firm command and I would automatically obey. I looked down at his hand wrapped around my wrist. I did not pull away frantically. I did not struggle. I rotated my arm and broke his grip with a sharp, calculated twist. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my ivory gown. I looked down at the man sitting in the groom's chair. I did not speak to him. There were no words left to exchange. I turned away from the sweetheart table. I looked toward the audio-visual booth situated on the far side of the dance floor. The technician was sitting behind his soundboard monitoring the background music. He had the projector remote resting on the table next to him. The launch codes were ready. It was time. I stepped down from the raised platform. The heavy fabric of my ivory gown brushed the edge of the wooden stairs. I did not look back at Preston. I navigated the outer perimeter of the dance floor, moving with a steady, measured stride. Guests seated at the nearby tables were still eating their butternut squash bisque. A few people looked up from their porcelain bowls, expecting me to walk toward the restroom or perhaps visit a family member. A bride walking alone through a reception hall always draws a specific type of attention. I ignored their curious glances. I kept my posture straight and my eyes fixed on the audio-visual booth located at the far end of the room. I thought about the large projection screen rolled up inside the ceiling recess just above the main stage. Beatrice had hired a professional videographer to compile a 10-minute multimedia presentation. It was scheduled to play during the dessert course. The video featured photographs from our college graduations, scenic pictures from vacations we took to coastal resorts, and heavily edited engagement shots. It was a carefully curated montage designed to sell a specific narrative of flawless prosperity. In my line of work at the Emergency Communications Center, we rely on raw, unedited data. We do not edit out the static on the radio or the long pauses from a terrified caller. We need the unvarnished truth to send the right rescue units to the right coordinates. The Caldwell family operated on filtered realities. I was about to give this room the raw, unvarnished truth. The audiovisual technician was a young man wearing a black polo shirt and a bulky headset. He sat behind a wide mixing console covered in glowing buttons and sliding volume faders. His job was to manage the string quartet microphones, monitor the ambient room audio, and cue the upcoming speeches. He looked up as I approached his station. He offered a polite, accommodating smile, likely assuming I wanted to request a song change or adjust the lighting. I reached into the hidden seam pocket of my wedding gown. I pulled out my cell phone. Before I left the hallway with the leather clipboard, I had taken high-resolution photographs of every single document inside the accounting folder. The voided Caldwell check, the red insufficient funds stamp, my father's certified cashier's check. The entire paper trail was digitized and sitting in my camera roll. I unlocked the screen and opened the photo gallery. I set the phone down on the mixing console right next to his hand. I pointed to the black video cable resting coiled on the edge of his table. I told him to take that cable and plug it into my device. The technician frowned. He looked at the glowing screen of the phone and then up at my face. He explained that his system was pre-loaded with the official slideshow file. He said the event coordinator had given him strict instructions not to alter the digital schedule under any circumstances. He was a hired contractor, and he was afraid of losing his payment. I leaned forward. I did not raise my voice to compete with the background music. I spoke to him using the steady, unwavering tone of a seasoned first responder directing a panicked civilian away from a hazard zone. I told him the event coordinator was no longer running this timeline. I told him I was the bride and I was giving him a direct operational command. I instructed him to plug in the cable switch the video input source to my phone and drop the projector screen. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he read the expression in my eyes. He recognized that I was not making a polite request. I was issuing a final directive. He picked up the cable and connected it to my phone's port. He pressed a sequence of buttons on his console. Above the main stage, a low motorized hum signaled the large white canvas screen unrolling from the ceiling. I reached across the mixing board and picked up the wireless microphone resting in its charging cradle. The metal casing felt heavy and cool against my palm. I gripped it tight. I told the technician to cut the music. He reached for the master volume fader and slid it all the way down to the bottom track. The classical music playing through the overhead speakers vanished instantly. The sudden absence of audio created a vacuum in the room. 300 people were suddenly left with nothing but the sound of their own silverware scraping against porcelain plates. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate and unsettling. Wealthy social events rely on ambient noise to mask private conversations. Taking away the music removed their cover. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned towards the front of the room. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps onto the main stage. The stage was positioned directly behind the dance floor, offering an unobstructed view of every single table in the venue. The lighting technician, noticing the music stop, automatically aimed a single bright spotlight onto the center of the wooden floorboards. I stepped directly into the circle of white light. I stood there for 5 seconds. I let the silence stretch. I let the confusion settle into the minds of the private equity investors, the fraternity brothers, and the country club elite. I looked down at table 1. Beatrice had returned from her walk. She was sitting next to Jim Harrison holding a linen napkin in her lap, looking up at me with narrow, suspicious eyes. Preston was still standing near the sweetheart table. His face was rigid with panic. He knew he had lost control of the asset. I raised the microphone to my lips. Most of you came here today to witness a union. My voice echoed through the high-fidelity sound system. It was clear and sharp. It bounced off the vaulted ceilings and reached every corner of the vast ballroom. I did not let my voice waver. I spoke with the objective precision of a dispatcher broadcasting a critical alert across the radio channels. I looked out at the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. I saw the faces of men and women who calculated human worth by the balance of a stock portfolio. I saw the people who had gladly accepted an invitation to a luxury dinner party without ever wondering who actually signed the checks. But before we toast, I owe you the truth about the seating chart. The room remained dead silent. The guests were captivated by the strange opening. They likely assumed I was about to deliver a sentimental speech. They expected a tearful anecdote about family bonds or a touching story about overcoming wedding day stress. They were waiting for the standard bridal performance. I raised my free hand and pointed a single finger toward the back of the room. I aimed it directly past the crystal centerpieces, past the tiered wedding cake, and past the polished dance floor. "Please look at table 18 by the trash cans." I did not soften the description. I did not call it the back of the room. I used the exact unsanitized terminology. I wanted the investors at table 1 to hear the harsh reality of the floor plan. I wanted them to know exactly what kind of environment they were sitting in. A rustle of fabric swept through the venue. 300 heads turned in unison. It was a synchronized wave of motion. Guests shifted in their padded chairs. They craned their necks around floral arrangements. They followed the direction of my pointing finger toward the dim lighting of the exit sign. They saw the plastic folding table. They saw the uneven legs resting on the hardwood floor. They saw the swinging aluminum doors of the kitchen service entrance. They saw the gray rubber busboy station and the foot pedal garbage bin, and they saw my parents. My father was still sitting straight and tall in his outdated suit. My mother was holding her hands tightly in her lap. They were suddenly the focal point of the entire high society event. 300 pairs of eyes were staring at the county mechanic and the middle school bus driver sitting next to the dish pit. I watched the expressions on the faces of the guests. I saw the initial confusion morph into deep discomfort. I saw a few women lower their heads, realizing the inherent cruelty of the setup. I saw Jim Harrison frown, his thick eyebrows pulling together in a tight line. He looked at the garbage bin and then looked back toward Beatrice Caldwell. He was a ruthless businessman, but even ruthless businessmen understand the basic rules of social decency. He recognized a profound insult when he saw one. Beatrice went entirely rigid. The color drained from her cheeks. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the table 1. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her pristine public image was cracking under the glare of the spotlight. She had spent the last 8 months building an invisible wall around my family, and I had just detonated that wall in front of her most important clients. Preston took a hesitant step toward the stage. He held his hands out, his palms facing upward, a universal gesture of pleading. He mouthed my name. He wanted to stop the broadcast. He wanted to pull the plug before the real damage was done. But the microphone was in my hand. The projector screen was lowered and ready behind me. The initial shockwave had hit the room, exposing the physical disrespect. The guests had seen the plastic folding chairs. They had seen the trash can. Now it was time to tell them exactly who was sitting in those chairs and why the Caldwell family had placed them there. The silence in the ballroom stretched so tight, it felt brittle. I watched the realization wash over the faces of the 300 guests. They followed my pointing finger through the dim lighting of the venue. They stared at the aluminum kitchen doors, the rubber scraping station, and the uneven folding table. They were looking at a man who spent his life under the heavy steel chassis of municipal diesel trucks and a woman who safely transported their children to school every morning. They saw the cheap printer paper acting as place cards. I lowered my arm, bringing my hand back to the center of my chest. I raised the wireless microphone closer to my mouth, my voice cutting through the heavy, stagnant air. I told the room that the seating arrangement they were witnessing was not a mistake. I told them it was not a logistical error made by the catering staff or a last-minute adjustment caused by a crowded floor plan. I shifted my gaze and pointed my free hand directly at table 1. I aimed it at Beatrice Caldwell. I stated clearly that the mother of the groom had intentionally assigned my parents to a plastic table next to a trash receptacle. I watched Beatrice freeze, her posture locked into a rigid defensive stance. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned a stark bone white. The polite, generous hostess facade she had worn all evening cracked straight down the middle. I did not stop. I explained exactly why she did it. I told the audience that Beatrice Caldwell believed a county mechanic and a public school bus driver did not fit the pristine high society aesthetic of her event. I told them she was terrified. I explained that she feared if the elite investors seated at table 1 saw my parents sitting in the VIP section, the Caldwell brand would be irreparably tarnished. She viewed honest manual labor as a toxic liability to her corporate image. I looked down at the welcome tables situated near the entrance doors. I told the crowd to open the heavy ivory wedding programs resting at their individual place settings. I instructed them to look at the second page. I explained that 3 weeks ago I had personally formatted that document to include the names of the hardworking people who raised me. I told the room that Beatrice had secretly confiscated the digital file, deleted my parents' names entirely, and replaced them with a fabricated gold foil family crest. I told them she had socially erased the working class from the historical record of this evening to protect her counterfeit aristocracy. A low collective murmur began to ripple across the ballroom. The guests seated at the tables closest to the stage started flipping open their folded programs. The crisp sound of thick, textured paper turning echoed throughout the quiet room. They saw the rearing gold lions. They saw the corporate sponsor list printed at the bottom. The wealthy attendees, people who usually avoided social unpleasantness at all costs, were suddenly confronting the ugly reality of their hosts. They realized they had been invited to participate in a cruel public humiliation. They were being used as props in a theatrical performance designed to isolate my family. Jim Harrison dropped his linen napkin onto his half-eaten plate of butternut squash bisque. The lead investor of the Harrison Group leaned back in his velvet chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He cast a sharp, scrutinizing look at Beatrice. He was a man who built financial empires by reading human behavior, and he had just recognized a profound lack of basic character in the woman sitting next to him. Beatrice opened her mouth to defend herself. She tried to project a look of maternal shock, shaking her head side to side, silently appealing to the investors around her. She could not find any words. The truth was too specific, and the physical evidence was sitting right in front of everyone. I shifted my gaze away from Beatrice. I looked at the man standing near the sweetheart table. Preston had abandoned his relaxed, confident posture. He took 2 rapid steps toward the center of the dance floor, closing the distance between us. His face was flushed a dark, angry red, creeping up his neck and settling into his jawline. He raised his hands, gesturing frantically for me to lower the microphone. He tried to deploy his smooth corporate charm one last time. He called my name, his voice tight with rising panic, telling me I was upset and we needed to discuss this privately in the hallway. He took a step toward the wooden stairs leading up to the stage. I did not retreat. I used the command voice I reserved for hostile callers trying to hijack a dispatch line. I told him to stay exactly where he was. Preston stopped dead in his tracks. His polished leather shoes halted at the edge of the bottom step. I gripped the microphone tighter. I looked him dead in the eye and broadcast his betrayal to the entire room. I told the guests that I had confronted my fiancé about the folding chairs and the erased programs 10 minutes before the reception began. I told them I had walked into the groom's suite and begged him to defend the dignity of my family. I repeated his exact response word for word over the sound system. I told the room that Preston Caldwell had sighed in annoyance and ordered me not to cause drama. I told them he explicitly stated that his mother's fraudulent optics were more important than my parents' pride. I repeated his claim that the primary investors required priority seating to secure capital and that my family was tough enough to endure the back of the room. I laid his cowardice bare under the bright white beam of the stage spotlight. The blood drained from Preston's face, leaving him pale and exposed. He looked around the room desperate for an ally. He looked at his fraternity brothers hoping for an intervention, but they were staring intently at their shoes. He looked at Jim Harrison, but the investor averted his eyes in sheer disgust. The man I had loved was suddenly standing alone on a crowded dance floor, stripped of his charm, his leverage, and his carefully constructed narrative. I glanced back at the far corner of the room. My mother had stopped trying to fold her cheap linen napkin. She was sitting upright, her hands clasped tightly together on the plastic tabletop. Tears were shining in her eyes, not from embarrassment, but from a deep sense of vindication. For the first time all day, she did not look like an unwanted guest. She looked like the mother of a woman who refused to be bullied. My father was sitting straight and tall next to her. He no longer looked like a man absorbing an insult. He looked like a man watching his daughter fight a war on his behalf. The shame had lifted from his shoulders, transferring directly onto the Caldwell family where it belonged. But emotional cruelty is easily dismissed by the upper echelon of society. Elite circles are built on exclusionary tactics and polite slights. A ruined seating chart and a deleted name on a program were terrible, but they were not fatal to a corporate empire. Preston and Beatrice were currently experiencing severe social embarrassment, but they likely believed they could spin the narrative by tomorrow morning. They probably thought they could blame my outburst on severe wedding day stress, issue a polite apology to the investors, and salvage the financial merger. They believed the worst was over. They thought this was merely the emotional breakdown of an overwhelmed bride. They did not know that the social humiliation was merely the appetizer. They did not realize that I had not yet deployed the weapons sitting on the audio-visual mixing console. I had exposed their total lack of human decency, but I was about to expose something the Harrison Group cared about far more than a seating chart. I was about to expose their money. I looked down at the small black plastic remote resting in my palm. The audio-visual technician had handed it to me right before I stepped onto the stage. It had a single green button at the top. I pressed it. Behind me, the 20-foot canvas screen illuminated. The sudden burst of bright artificial light cast long, dark shadows across the polished dance floor. The guests seated at the front tables blinked, shielding their eyes from the sudden glare. I turned my head just enough to verify the digital image had rendered correctly on the large surface. It was a high-resolution photograph of the financial document I had found on the wedding coordinator's clipboard. The Caldwell investment firm logo sat at the top left corner in crisp black ink. The numbers written on the center line read $40,000, but the most prominent feature was not the amount. It was the bright red bank stamp angled across the authorized signature line. The letters were stark and undeniable insufficient funds. I turned back to face the crowd. I raised the wireless microphone. I told them there was a profound irony to the seating chart they had just witnessed. I explained that Beatrice Caldwell had isolated my family because she wanted to project an image of untouchable prosperity to the Harrison Group. I shifted my focus and locked eyes directly with Jim Harrison. I told him the image he had been sold was a total fabrication. I stated clearly that the Caldwell investment firm was secretly insolvent. The collective sharp intake of breath from Table 1 was audible even without the aid of the sound system. Men who manage billion-dollar hedge funds do not like being surprised. They despise being conned. Jim Harrison leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the red ink projected on the wall. He recognized the specific routing numbers. He knew exactly what a bounced corporate check signaled in this industry. It signaled a death spiral. It meant the firm had zero liquidity and was operating on fumes and false promises. My father spent his entire career paying into the North Carolina State Employee Retirement System. He worked overtime shifts during winter ice storms and summer hurricane warnings to build a reliable safety net. He drove a 15-year-old truck so he could maximize his monthly pension contributions. He understood the value of delayed gratification and honest labor. He played by the rules. The Caldwell family, on the other hand, played with reckless leverage. When their financial leverage collapsed, they did not accept the consequences of their poor management. They looked for a secret bailout to keep their social standing intact. I pressed the green button on the remote a second time. The projector cycled to the next image in my phone gallery. The bright red bank stamp vanished. It was replaced by the crisp blue ink of a state credit union cashier's check. The designated payee was the Oakwood Country Club. The amount was exactly $40,000. The processing date stamp read yesterday afternoon, and the signature resting on the bottom line was Tom Morgan. I pointed to the illuminated screen. I told the room that when the Caldwell corporate check bounced yesterday morning, the venue manager threatened to cancel this entire reception. I explained that Preston and Beatrice had no liquid assets left in any of their accounts to save their own event. I told the guests that the man sitting next to the garbage bin, the man they deemed too rustic to sit in the VIP section, had walked into his local credit union and drained his life savings to prevent a cancellation. I swept my gaze across the round tables. I looked at the imported floral centerpieces, the silk table runners, and the crystal glassware. I instructed the attendees to look down at their place settings. I informed them that the roasted butternut squash bisque they had just tasted and the prime filet mignon they were about to be served were not corporate hosting expenses. I told them every single bite of food in this building, every drop of champagne, and every hour of music was purchased by a blue-collar mechanic. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from uncomfortable social tension to outright disgust. Wealthy individuals will tolerate arrogance, and they will often excuse minor deceptions, but they will not tolerate outright theft. They recognized that Beatrice and Preston had exploited a working-class man to fund a fake high-society gala designed to steal their investment capital. Several guests seated near the front physically pushed their plates away. The sound of porcelain scraping against the heavy table linens echoed in the silent room. The domino effect rippled backward through the venue. Dozens of people set down their silver forks and pushed their chairs back from the tables, refusing to consume another bite of the extorted meal. The illusion of the evening shattered into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. Women in designer gowns whispered frantically behind their hands, while their husbands reached for their cell phones, likely texting their own financial advisors to sever any ties with the Caldwell brand. The social execution was swift and merciless. Jim Harrison stood up from his velvet chair. He did not look at Beatrice. He did not ask her for an explanation or demand an apology. He simply reached down and picked up his suit jacket from the back of his seat. He signaled to his two senior partners. The men stood up in unison. The Harrison group was leaving the building. Beatrice Caldwell reached out her hand trembling, trying to grab Jim Harrison's sleeve as he turned away. He stepped out of her reach with swift, practiced efficiency. He gave her a look of such profound contempt that she recoiled. Her posture collapsed. The rigid, aristocratic spine she had maintained for years folded inward. She brought her hands up to cover her face, hiding from the glare of the projector and the condemning stares of her former peers. The $10 million capital injection was gone. The pending corporate merger was dead. Her boutique firm would inevitably face a federal audit by Monday morning. The counterfeit empire was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. Preston scrambled up the wooden stairs toward the stage. He was no longer trying to manage the optics or project calm authority. He was operating on pure, unregulated panic. He lunged toward the audiovisual cart, trying to pull the video cables out of the mixing console to stop the projection. The technician stepped in his way, crossing his arms and shielding the equipment with his body. Preston spun around to face me. His chest was heaving. His pristine tailored tuxedo jacket was wrinkled and distorted. His hair had lost its styled shape, falling across his forehead. He pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded I turn the projector off immediately. He accused me of ruining his career and destroying his family name. He told me I was his wife and I was supposed to protect him. He claimed I owed him loyalty. I looked at the desperation in his eyes. He had spent 2 years asking me to shrink my identity and hide my roots to serve his needs. He had stood in front of a mirror and brushed off my concerns while his mother shoved my parents into the shadows. He had no concept of actual loyalty. He only understood transactions. I lowered the microphone from my mouth. I looked at the ruined man standing on the stage. He still believed he had a right to make demands. He still thought we were bound together by the ceremonial vows we had spoken an hour ago. He assumed that because I was wearing a white dress, I was legally tethered to his sinking ship and obligated to share his ruin. He did not know about the blank piece of paper waiting on the sweetheart table. He was about to find out that my tactical extraction was already secured. I raised the microphone one last time. I refuse to sign my name to a family of cowards and frauds. I delivered the sentence with total, unwavering clarity. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject any anger or sorrow into the delivery. I issued the statement as a matter of public record. It was the final operational update of a closed incident. I reached over and set the wireless microphone down onto the wooden podium. A brief electronic pop echoed through the speakers, signaling that the broadcast was officially terminated. I reached up to the crown of my head. Beatrice had insisted I wear a sweeping cathedral-length veil crafted from imported French lace. She said it provided the correct silhouette for the country club aesthetic. The fabric was heavy, anchored to my scalp by a dozen metal bobby pins. I pulled the pins out one by one. I felt the physical weight lift from my shoulders. I gathered the sheer white material in my hands, pulled it free from my hair, and draped it over the edge of the wooden podium. It hung there like a discarded ghost. I reached down to the top of the audio-visual console where I had rested the navy blue leather folio. I had retrieved it from the sweetheart table right before hijacking the projector. I flipped the leather cover open. Inside sat the pristine watermarked document issued by the Wake County Register of Deeds, the official state marriage license. I pulled the thick paper out of the protective sleeve. I held it up high enough for the investors at Table 1 to see the blank signature lines. I gripped the top edge of the document with both hands and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper was crisp and sharp. It carried across the silent dance floor. I stacked the two halves together and tore them again. I let the 4 pieces of ruined paper slip from my fingers. They fluttered down, coming to rest on the varnished wood of the stage floor. The legal liability was severed. The contract was void. I turned my back on Preston. I stepped down the 3 carpeted stairs and walked onto the main floor. The distance from the stage to table 18 was 80 feet. It was the longest and most liberating walk of my life. I moved down the center aisle, my satin heels clicking a steady, unbroken rhythm against the hardwood. The environment around me had undergone a profound transformation. 10 minutes ago, this room was an intimidating fortress of old money and exclusionary power. Now it was just a quiet dining hall filled with embarrassed people. I looked at the tables as I passed them. The curated luxury felt hollow. The ice in the crystal water glasses was melting. The expensive butternut squash bisque sat cooling in porcelain bowls entirely untouched. The guests who had previously looked at me with polite condescension now averted their eyes. The country club members shifted in their velvet chairs, leaning away from the center aisle as I approached. The social hierarchy had collapsed. The Caldwells were paralyzed at the front of the room, stripped of their armor, unable to issue a single command to stop my exit. I passed the center tier of tables. I felt the ambient temperature of the room shift. The cool air conditioning near the dance floor gave way to the warm, humid draft leaking through the kitchen service entrance. I reached the back corner of the venue. The lighting was dim. The exit sign cast a dull red glow over the plastic folding chairs. My father was already standing. He had stepped out from behind the narrow table. He stood tall and solid, a towering fixture in his worn dark suit. His broad shoulders were squared. His jaw was set. My mother stood right beside him, clutching her small beaded purse to her chest. She was no longer shrinking. She stood with her chin lifted, her eyes shining with fierce, undeniable pride. I stepped into the narrow space between the garbage bin and the folding table. I reached out and looped my arm through my father's arm. The coarse wool of his old suit jacket felt like a shield. I looked up at his familiar weathered face. "We are going home," I said the words quietly. He offered a single firm nod. We turned together toward the swinging aluminum doors. Footsteps slapped rapidly against the hardwood floor behind us. The sound was frantic and chaotic, devoid of any measured grace. Preston was running. He abandoned all high society decorum. He sprinted across the empty dance floor, dodging round tables and bumping past seated guests. His breathing was ragged. He cut us off right before we reached the kitchen threshold. He stepped in front of the aluminum doors, blocking our exit. He reached out and grabbed my bare bicep. His grip was slick with sweat. His face was a portrait of total ruin. He was no longer the smug junior vice president adjusting his watch in the mirror. He was a terrified man watching his entire safety net burn to ash. His bow tie was askew. His tailored dress shirt was rumpled. He begged. The words tumbled out of his mouth in a frantic, desperate rush. He whispered that I was destroying his life. He told me the Harrison Group was walking out of the building. He pleaded for me to go back to the stage. He wanted me to tell the investors that the slideshow was a cruel prank, a misunderstanding, a stress-induced bridal breakdown. He wanted me to fall on my sword, humiliate myself, and patch the leak in his sinking corporate ship. I looked at his hand wrapped around my arm. I did not fight him. I did not struggle to break his hold. I looked up into his panicked eyes. The clinical detachment inside my mind was absolute. In the dispatch center, when an instigator tries to blame the victim for the fallout of their own actions, you do not debate them. You state the reality of the situation and you terminate the connection. "You did this to your family," I said. My voice was low, devoid of any sympathy. "I just turned on the lights." My father stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue a threat. He simply placed his large, calloused hand over Preston's wrist. My father did not squeeze. He applied the heavy, immovable weight of a man who spends his life wrestling steel engine blocks into submission. Preston looked at my father's hand. He looked at my father's face. The mechanic he had tried to hide in the trash was now the only thing standing between him and his former bride. Preston let go. He dropped his arm and stepped backward, retreating into the shadows of the dining room. My father pushed the aluminum doors open. We stepped out of the ballroom and into the main kitchen. The culinary staff was frozen in place. Line cooks, sous chefs, and dishwashers stood motionless in their white aprons. They were holding silver trays and wiping down stainless steel prep stations. They had listened to the entire broadcast echoing through the service doors. They parted like the sea, stepping aside in total silence, creating a clear, unobstructed path for us to walk through the maze of commercial ovens. We reached the heavy steel fire doors at the back of the kitchen. I pushed the crash bar. The doors swung open, shutting off the air conditioning and the counterfeit world behind us. We stepped out onto the concrete loading dock. The humid North Carolina night air wrapped around us instantly. The smell of pine needles, warm asphalt, and diesel exhaust replaced the cloying scent of imported orchids. The steady hum of crickets in the nearby tree line felt incredibly loud after the tense silence of the reception hall. At the bottom of the concrete ramp, a car engine was idling. The headlights cut a bright swath through the darkness of the service alley. Jessica was sitting behind the steering wheel. The trunk was already loaded with my luggage. The passenger doors were unlocked and waiting. We walked down the ramp and got into the vehicle. My parents climbed into the back. I slid into the front passenger seat. Jessica shifted the car into drive and pressed the accelerator. We pulled away from the loading dock, leaving the Oakwood Country Club to deal with the wreckage. I sat back against the headrest and exhaled. The extraction was successful. The hazard zone was cleared. But as we turned out of the service alley and merged onto the main road, the interior of the car was suddenly illuminated by a rapid flashing light. My cell phone resting in my lap began to vibrate relentlessly against the fabric of my dress. The screen displayed a chaotic barrage of incoming text messages and missed calls. The caller identification flashed the names in rapid succession: Beatrice Richard Preston. The shock was wearing off for the Caldwell family, and the frantic retaliation was just beginning. The public execution was over, but the war to establish the final boundary was waiting for me. At sunrise, the morning sun cut through the blinds of my childhood bedroom. I was sitting on the edge of the narrow mattress wearing a borrowed oversized sweater. My custom ivory gown was zipped inside a plastic garment bag hanging from the closet door. It looked like a relic from a different lifetime. I picked up my cell phone from the nightstand. The screen was choked with notifications. Beatrice Caldwell had spent the hours between midnight and sunrise launching a frantic digital counterattack. She utilized every social media platform at her disposal to control the narrative. She drafted lengthy paragraphs claiming I had suffered a severe stress-induced psychological break during the reception. She told her followers that my presentation was a paranoid delusion brought on by the pressures of marrying into a prominent family. She portrayed herself as a heartbroken mother mourning the sudden mental collapse of her future daughter-in-law. She turned off the comment sections on her posts to prevent anyone from contradicting her carefully constructed fiction. Jessica sat across from me in a wooden desk chair, holding a mug of black coffee. She scrolled through the fabricated posts on her own device. As a paralegal, she deals with defamation and public relations crises on a daily basis. She looked over the rim of her mug and asked if I wanted to release a statement. She offered to draft a concise, factual timeline and publish the digitized bank documents online to shut Beatrice down. I shook my head. I instructed Jessica to lock my social media profiles and block every phone number associated with the Caldwell family or their boutique firm. In the emergency dispatch center, you learn that engaging with a hysterical person only validates their panic and prolongs the chaos. You do not argue with someone who is determined to lie. You let silence do the heavy lifting. I did not need to defend my character on the internet. I did not need to post receipts or argue with strangers in a comment thread. I had something far more powerful than a social media statement. I had 300 eyewitnesses. Beatrice failed to understand a fundamental rule of elite social circles. Wealthy people do not care about online sympathy. They care about their own risk exposure. The country club guests had sat in that ballroom and watched the projector screen illuminate a bounced check for $40,000. They had seen the stark red insufficient funds stamp. They had witnessed the structural collapse of the Caldwell financial portfolio. Beatrice could type as many frantic paragraphs as she wanted, but she could not erase the memory of that digital slide from the minds of the men who controlled the local economy. The social media campaign was a smokescreen designed to hide a burning building. By Monday morning, the smoke cleared, and the real fire consumed the Caldwell investment firm. Jim Harrison did not use social networks to communicate his displeasure. He used corporate attorneys. At 8 o'clock on Monday morning, his legal team transmitted a single-page document to the Caldwell offices. The document formally withdrew the $10 million letter of intent. Jim Harrison cited a breach of fiduciary trust and a failure to disclose material financial liabilities. The withdrawal was swift, clinical, and devastating. The Harrison Group was the anchor investor. In the world of boutique finance, an anchor investor dictates the weather. When Jim Harrison pulled his capital, he triggered a catastrophic domino effect. The other corporate sponsors listed on the fabricated wedding programs immediately panicked. Apex, Capital Holdings, and the Vanguard Equity Trust ordered their risk management teams to review every single contract tied to Preston and Richard Caldwell. By Tuesday afternoon, the rumors of the bounced catering check had saturated the downtown banking district. Financial institutions operate on a strict foundation of projected stability. A firm that cannot afford to feed its own wedding guests is a firm that cannot be trusted to manage private wealth. The Caldwell's client roster began to hemorrhage. Long-term accounts were liquidated. Transfer requests flooded their administrative desks. Preston spent Tuesday trapped inside his glass-walled office making desperate phone calls. He tried to reach out to his former fraternity brothers, hoping to secure short-term bridge loans to keep the firm afloat. He called rival investment groups begging for a lateral transfer or a buyout option. His calls went straight to voicemail. His emails received automated out-of-office replies. The men who had cheerfully drank his vintage champagne on Saturday night treated him like a toxic contaminant by Tuesday afternoon. His career in the Raleigh financial sector was effectively obliterated in 48 hours. The private sector exodus was severe, but the true fatal blow arrived on Wednesday morning. A bounced $40,000 check to a country club vendor is a civil dispute, but operating an insolvent investment firm while actively soliciting millions of dollars from private equity partners crosses a very dark legal line. The rapid withdrawal of the Harrison Group caught the attention of the regulatory authorities. At 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, investigators from the North Carolina State Financial Board arrived at the Caldwell boutique firm. They did not schedule an appointment. They walked past the receptionist and presented an official notice of audit. They demanded access to the corporate ledgers, the escrow accounts, and the digital communication servers. They froze the remaining operational funds to prevent the Caldwells from moving any hidden assets offshore. The illusion of the inside-the-beltline aristocracy was dismantled piece by piece under the fluorescent lights of a government audit. While Richard and Preston Caldwell dealt with the state investigators, Beatrice faced her own brutal reckoning. Her punishment did not come from a courtroom. It came from the wood-paneled boardrooms of the country club elite. On Wednesday evening, the Oakwood Country Club Board of Directors convened an emergency session. Beatrice was the acting chairwoman of the annual spring gala and held seats on 3 different philanthropic committees. The board members did not fire her with a public declaration. High society operates with a chilling, sterile politeness. They dispatched a courier to her residence with a handwritten letter on heavy stationery. The letter requested she take an indefinite leave of absence from all committee duties to focus on her pressing family matters. The envelope also contained her deactivated club access card. The social exile was absolute. The women who had attended her rehearsal dinner, the women who had laughed at her jokes and admired her tailored silk suits severed all ties. Beatrice was no longer invited to the charity luncheons. She was removed from the silent auction guest lists. She was exiled from the only world that gave her identity any meaning. She had traded her basic human decency to protect her social standing, and the transaction had left her with absolutely nothing. I watched the fallout from a distance. I sat on the porch of my parents' house drinking coffee with my father before he drove to the county maintenance yard for his morning shift. We did not celebrate the ruin of the Caldwell family. We did not gloat. We simply observed the natural mechanics of consequence. The karma was deeply satisfying because it was entirely organic. I did not plant any false evidence. I did not initiate a smear campaign. I simply took the truth they had worked so hard to bury and handed it directly to the people they were trying to deceive. They had built an empire on a foundation of gasoline, and I had merely provided the spark. The autumn months rolled in, bringing crisp air and a quiet routine back to my life. I returned to my shifts at the emergency dispatch center. My father received a full reimbursement for his $40,000 cashier's check after the country club filed a creditor claim against the frozen Caldwell assets. The wedding incident slowly faded from the local gossip columns, replaced by new scandals and shifting corporate mergers. I believed the hazard zone was permanently secured. I thought the Caldwell family had retreated into the shadows to face their state penalties in private. I assumed I would never have to look at Preston's face or hear his voice again. I failed to anticipate the difference between a state regulatory audit and a federal investigation. Financial fraud of that magnitude rarely stops at the state level. The State Financial Board had uncovered discrepancies in the Caldwell ledgers that triggered mandatory reporting protocols. The file was quietly transferred to a much higher authority. The Securities and Exchange Commission had been watching the ashes of the Caldwell firm smolder all winter. They were preparing to escalate the investigation from civil penalties to federal criminal charges. The looming threat of a federal indictment changes the psychology of a desperate man. It strips away pride and replaces it with pure survival instinct. That terror was currently building inside Preston Caldwell, and it was about to drive him out of his exile and send him walking straight up the wooden steps of my father's front porch. 1 year later, I sit at the center desk of the Emergency Communications Hub. I wear a silver badge on my lapel that reads, Shift Supervisor. When a new dispatcher freezes during a high-stakes call, I am the one who plugs into their console. I take over the frequency. I guide the caller through the crisis, and I restore the baseline. I built a quiet, authentic life by doing what I do best. I manage the reality of a situation rather than the optics. It was a Saturday morning in late October. The air in North Carolina had turned crisp, carrying the scent of dried leaves and wood smoke. I was sitting on the front porch of my parents' house, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. My father was 10 feet away in the driveway. He was lying on a wooden creeper board rolled halfway underneath a restored pickup truck, tightening the bolts on the transmission housing. It was a peaceful domestic morning. The hazard zone of the Oakwood Country Club felt like a distant fading echo. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. A vehicle turned off the main road and pulled into our driveway. I lowered my coffee mug. The car was not a sleek black luxury sedan. It was not a European import with custom-tinted windows. It was a domestic 4-door compact car. The paint on the hood was dull and chipped. The engine knocked with a harsh, uneven rhythm before the driver turned the ignition off. The driver's side door opened. The hinges groaned. A man stepped out onto the gravel. It took me a full 3 seconds to recognize Preston Caldwell. The pristine junior vice president was gone. The tailored tuxedo and the expensive haircut had vanished. He was wearing a wrinkled blue button-down shirt tucked into generic khaki pants. His shoulders were slumped, pulled forward by an invisible, crushing weight. Dark, hollow circles bruised the skin under his eyes. He looked a decade older than the man I had left standing on the country club stage. He walked toward the porch with a hesitant, uneven gait. The Securities and Exchange Commission operates with a ruthless thoroughness that outpaces any state-level audit. Federal prosecutors do not care about country club memberships or curated charity galas. They care about wire fraud, investor deception, and the illegal transfer of funds. When the federal authorities took over the Caldwell file, they froze every single asset tied to the family. They seized the brokerage accounts. They placed liens on the residential properties. They impounded the luxury vehicles. Preston had been stripped down to his bare actual worth, and without his mother's money to insulate him, there was very little left. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden porch stairs. He did not attempt a smooth greeting. He did not offer a charming smile. He looked up at me with eyes wide and frantic with raw survival instinct. He clutched a thick manila folder to his chest. He took a breath, and the words spilled out of his mouth in a desperate, breathless rush. He told me the federal indictment was coming down on Tuesday. He said the prosecutors were building a case around the timeline of the firm's insolvency. The core of their argument hinged on the fact that the Caldwells continued to solicit millions of dollars from the Harrison Group while knowing their operational accounts were overdrawn. He pointed to the folder in his hands. He told me the catering deposit was the final nail in their coffin. The prosecutors had subpoenaed the venue records. They saw the bounced corporate check. They saw my father's cashier's check replacing it hours later. The paper trail proved the Caldwells were bankrupt right before they pitched the Harrison Group. It proved criminal intent to defraud investors. Preston took a step up the wooden stairs. His knuckles were white against the paper folder. He told me his defense attorney had drafted a sworn affidavit. He needed my signature. He needed me to go on the legal record and state that the $40,000 payment from my father was not a venue bailout. He needed me to claim it was a spontaneous wedding gift given directly to the Caldwell firm. He wanted me to lie under oath to alter the timeline of their bankruptcy. He said a single signature from me would create enough reasonable doubt to downgrade the charges from a federal felony to a civil misdemeanor. He looked at my face and his voice cracked. He begged me. He told me he was facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. He said his mother was under house arrest. He told me I owed it to our shared history to save him from a prison cell. I sat in the porch chair. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the man holding the manila folder, and I felt nothing but a profound clinical detachment. I told him our shared history was a fabrication. I reminded him that when my family was facing the humiliation of Table 18, he told me to focus on your hair. He ordered me to play along to protect his investors. He sacrificed the dignity of the man who worked under diesel trucks just to keep his corporate charade alive. I looked at the wrinkled affidavit in his hands. I told him he was standing on the property of a man he tried to hide next to a garbage bin. I told him I would not commit perjury to save a coward. Preston let out a ragged, desperate sound. It was half sob and half growl. He stepped up onto the porch. He reached his hand out, aiming for my wrist, trying to use physical proximity to force my compliance, just like he had done in the groom's suite. He never made contact. The sound of metal clanking against concrete echoed from the driveway. My father slid out from underneath the pickup truck. He stood up. He was wearing his stained denim work pants and a faded gray shirt. His hands and forearms were coated in black motor oil. He picked up a red shop rag from the hood of the truck and wiped his fingers. He did not rush. He did not run toward the porch. He walked with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who knows exactly who he is. He climbed the wooden stairs. He stepped between Preston and my chair. "My father is a broad man." When he squared his shoulders, he entirely blocked Preston from my line of sight. My father did not raise a wrench. He did not clench his fists. He did not yell a single threat. True strength never has to shout to be understood. He stood on his own front porch, looked down at the man who had treated him like an expendable asset, and delivered the final verdict. "The door is closed, son." 5 words delivered with a steady, quiet rumble. Preston looked at the mechanic standing in front of him. He looked at the grease-stained hands and the unshakable posture. The ruined junior executive finally realized he possessed no leverage here. He could not charm his way out of this deficit. He could not buy a solution. He lowered the manila folder. His shoulders collapsed. He turned around, walked down the stairs, and dragged his feet across the gravel. He climbed into the driver's seat of the beat-up sedan. The engine knocked harshly as it turned over. He put the car in reverse, backed out onto the main road, and drove away to face his inevitable sentence. I sat on the porch and watched the car disappear around the bend. My father tossed the red shop rag onto the railing, turned to me, and asked if I wanted another cup of coffee. I smiled. I told him I would love one. I watched him walk through the screen door into the kitchen. I looked around the quiet yard. I thought about the crystal chandeliers and the velvet cushions I had left behind a year ago. I thought about the lengths people will go to in order to secure a seat at the tables of power. If you are watching this and you are currently sitting at a folding table next to the kitchen doors of someone else's life, if you have been told to shrink your identity, hide your roots, and swallow disrespect just to keep the peace, I want you to know something vital. The table they are offering you is an illusion. A seat built on the condition of your silence is not a place of honor. It is a trap. You do not have to endure their condescension. You do not have to fund their ego. You have every right to stand up, turn on the lights, and walk out of the room. The people who truly love you will never ask you to hide where you come from. They will sit with you on the front porch, and they will guard the door when the cowards come knocking. I walked away from a counterfeit kingdom to protect the people who mattered. And sitting on that wooden porch, listening to my father pour coffee in the kitchen, I realized the most beautiful truth of all. I never needed a seat at their table. I already had the best seat in the house. I sit at the center console of the emergency dispatch center, sipping coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. The headset rests lightly over one ear. It is quiet tonight. The digital clock on the wall ticks over to 2 in the morning. A year ago, I was standing in a 6-figure country club ballroom, surrounded by crystal and silk, feeling like I was suffocating. Today, in this windowless room with scuffed linoleum floors, I have never breathed easier. The contrast is sharp. It took a canceled wedding, a torn marriage license, and a public reckoning to find my peace. But I found it. When you survive a crisis, whether it is a highway collision or a toxic relationship, you do not just walk away empty-handed. You carry the data with you. You learn the geometry of the hazard zone so you never step into it again. If my time with the Caldwell family taught me anything, it boils down to these 5 truths. First, a seat at the table is worthless if it requires your silence. If you have to shrink your identity, hide your roots. Or apologize for the people who love you just to fit into their aesthetic. You are not a guest. You are a prop. Never fight for a chair in a room where you are not respected. Second, a partner's silence is their loudest confession. When Preston adjusted his bow tie and told me to focus on my hair, while his mother shoved my parents next to a trash can, he made his choice. Complicity is an active decision. A partner who watches you get disrespected and asks you to keep the peace is not protecting you. They are protecting themselves. Third, money cannot buy character and prestige cannot hide a fraud. The Caldwells had custom velvet chair covers and imported orchids, but their empire was built on bounced checks and extortion. My father had grease permanently stained into his cuticles, but he had the integrity to quietly drain his retirement to protect his daughter. Never confuse optics with actual worth. Fourth, you always have the power to walk away. It does not matter if the invitations are sent, the guests are seated, or the dress is paid for. Until you sign your name on the dotted line, you hold the leverage. Walking away from a bad situation is not failing. It is a tactical extraction. Finally, boundaries are not revenge. They are survival. When my dad stood on our front porch and told Preston the door was closed, he was not acting out of anger. He was simply securing the perimeter. You do not owe an explanation or a second chance to people who treated you like an expendable asset. I look at the blinking lights of my dispatch console. I don't wonder about Preston's federal indictment or Beatrice's social exile. I don't have room for it. My life is full, quiet, and authentically mine. I did not need their high society life. I already had the best seat in the house. If you are listening to this and you are currently trying to earn the love of people who always put you last, I see you. You deserve better than table 18. Stop shrinking. Stand up, turn on the lights, and walk out. Thank you for staying until the very end. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to Hazel Stories. We share real stories of survival and boundaries every single week. Tell me in the comments, what is the hardest boundary you have ever had to set? I read every single one. Until next time, keep the door closed to the people who don't value you.